at a bar in New York in the 1920s. There was a group of writers gathered, I'm sure having food and drink and conversation as a group of writers would do. One of the writers there was Ernest Hemingway, and as the conversation went on, one of the other writers challenged Hemingway, made a wager that he couldn't write a novel in just 6 words. Hemingway took out a pen, picked up a napkin, wrote down 6 words and passed it around the table, and then collected on the bet. These were the 6 words he wrote. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. In 6 words, he tells a story of grief and loss. There's also another saying that you never let the facts get in the way of a good story. For full disclosure, this story is kind of apocryphal. There is little hard evidence that links that 6-word story to Hemingway, and even less to link it to the bar bet, which is often attributed to the origin of that story. But that story is one of the ones that sort of kicks off an entire genre of 6-word stories. The idea that you can tell an entire story in just 6 words. To me, the joy and the beauty of a 6-word story is it strips away a lot, but it also lets the reader fill in a lot. You have to build characters and plot that the author doesn't for you. I think they work best when they elicit a strong emotional response. There are 6 words that make you feel joy or sadness or make you stop and think. Just to get you in the groove this morning, here's a couple more 6-word stories. 3 blind mice, 1 happy cat. Bought cheap guitar, no strings attached. Surprise 100th birthday party, bad idea. So they tell stories in 6 words, but we have to fill in a lot. We have to invent characters and realize what brought us to that point. The Easter story in Mark is, at least relatively speaking, the 6-word story of the resurrection of the 4 gospel stories. There's a lot that isn't there. Most of what we know and love about the Easter story comes from one of the other Gospels. In fact, in what Valinda read for us this morning, we don't even meet Jesus there. Now, there are a few more verses in Mark beyond that. We stopped at verse 8. It goes on until, I believe, verse 17. But most scholars believe the rest of that Gospel of Mark were written later and added on, maybe a couple centuries later, probably to bring it in line more with Matthew and Luke. But if we stop where that gospel originally stops, there at the end of verse 8, I find it interesting we don't encounter the risen Christ. I mean, that Easter story begins as the story we know well. Jesus died on the cross and was buried just prior to sunset on Friday, just prior to the beginning of the Sabbath. Of course, no work takes place on the Sabbath, including the preparation of the dead for burial. So the 3 women wait until after sunset on Saturday and the Sabbath ends to do that work, and then, for practical purposes, they wait for daylight on the next day. They head out the next morning to the tomb to do that work of preparing Jesus for a proper burial. I know I can't even begin to imagine the emotions that they had to be feeling at that point, having gone through what they had been through over the last week or so of life. And I'm also willing to venture none of you really can either. Because you see, for us in 21st century America, the work that they're doing, that work of caring for the dead, is now work that we almost exclusively let professionals handle. It's out of our sight. It's taken care of by people who do that for us. I mean, we're only maybe 150 years removed, though, from a time where caring for our loved ones who passed away may have happened in the home, and we may have been involved in it, but now it's out of our sight. It's handled by a funeral home. We typically aren't involved in that process. Now there's a lot to be said, and there's been a lot written on did we gain something, did we lose something by disconnecting ourselves from death in that way? One thing I do know for sure is I think we don't share a common experience with these women. I know, sure, there would have been feelings of grief for them as they were going out, but I think there would have been a feeling of being called to some sort of holy work as they were doing the work of preparing Jesus for burial. I know I personally, given my limited exposure, would have been very concerned about encountering someone who had been dead for a couple of days. Their concerns are more practical. How do we get into the tomb? The tomb, of course, been closed with a stone, and they're closed in such a way that gravity then is working against you. They're very difficult to get back open. But what they find is the stone is removed, and they find a young man in a white robe, is what the gospel says, easily interpreted as an angel. And that angel, as so often angels do, first to give them the message of to not be afraid, and then explains that Jesus isn't there. And it's not that his body has been stolen or taken away, he is risen. In fact, I think you can condense the angel's message to those three women into a very convincing 6-word story. Try this on with me, see if this works. Jesus risen says, meet in Galilee. That's it. That's Mark's resurrection story right there in those 6 words. It's an abrupt end to the gospel story. But it's not an end. It's really a beginning. If nothing else, the work for those 3 women changes. They go from doing the work of caring for someone who has died to becoming those who first preached the good news of the gospel. Now, I know Mark says they went home and said nothing, but for all practical purposes, that couldn't have been what actually happened, because otherwise we wouldn't know about this, right? They had to go, at some point they had to tell somebody something. But everything else we know about the resurrected Christ comes from the other gospel stories. In Mark, there is no revelation on the road to Emmaus. There is no breakfast on the beach. Thomas's reputation is never called into question. There's simply that message that Jesus has risen and he will meet them in Galilee. So it's not an end, it is a beginning of what will they do in Galilee. I know, it's not an end, it's a beginning. It's kind of a cliche. The only satisfaction I get is I get to use it a month before all the graduation speakers coming up in May. But it is a beginning. And to find the beginning of what is the beginning, it's simply a matter of looping back to the beginning of Mark. Remember, Mark is the shortest of the Gospels. It has this abrupt end. It also doesn't have a birth story. There is no Crispus in Mark's Gospel. It begins with Jesus' ministry in Galilee. This is how Mark begins. This is Mark 1:1. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's what began. The empty tomb verifies that Jesus is the Son of God. It provides us the promise of our own resurrection. Without the empty tomb at the end of the gospel, nothing else would matter. What Christ promised his disciples and what Christ promised us was true. That he would die and he would rise again. In Mark, he tells them 3 times, this is what will happen. And we know the disciples struggled with understanding this and seemed to not ever quite fully grasp what it was. But we now know there was never a reason for them to doubt Jesus. Jesus, who said he would die and rise again, then tells them he will ascend to heaven and then eventually return. And then we find ourselves living in that time in between. I find it sometimes interesting when those in-between times start to get long. I was reminded of one of my classes in college when I took history of modern Europe. As we made our way, really starting, I believe, at the Renaissance and into the Middle Ages, and we get to the end of World War II and sort of lay out post-World War II, Cold War Europe, and we stop, and the professor's like, "This is where we are." At that point in the mid-'80s, we were about 30 years removed. But he's like, "There's really nothing else to talk about. This is the world we live in." Christ has died. Christ has risen. Christ will come again. We're living in that in-between, between Christ is risen and Christ will come again. While we live in that in-between, we still are called to carry on the work that began with those first disciples and those first 3 women who went to that empty tomb. The work of sharing Jesus' teaching, that teaching he taught in Galilee, the time he spent preaching and healing and reaching out to those on the margins, those who may have been overlooked or told they didn't belong. That's the work we're called to continue today. And in case you're wondering if there's still work to be done, and if you still have a place in that work, there's a 6th word. It will be that moment when I'm able to throw my arms up in the air in victory and have those few seconds of triumph. Those athletes that they had the photographs of from the 2004 Olympics, as they'd won gold medals in judo, they didn't get there overnight, and they didn't get there without a lot of hard work. It took years of training and practice and listening to coaching and making sacrifices and showing up for all sorts of competitions before they ever reached the Olympic stage, and then to complete the Olympic competition to win that gold medal. We're somewhere in all of that process in each of our lives, on each of our journeys, as we are searching for that moment where we bring about God's kingdom. Here's the thing. If we're still here, God isn't finished with us. Each of us are on our own journey in our own place, but there's still something to do, whether it is in loving God, loving neighbor, whether it is being a voice where there is injustice. We continue to be who we are called to be as long as we're here.